Loyalty is one of those words that I think almost everyone responds to positively until you push on it. We admire loyal people. We want loyal friends, loyal partners, loyal colleagues, loyal customers. But we also know, without having to think too hard about it, that loyalty has covered for some of the worst things that people do to each other. The soldier who follows illegal orders. The friend who lies for someone who doesn't deserve it. The family that closes ranks around someone who causes real harm. So we need to ask, when does loyalty deepen our character, and when does it actually hollow it out? This episode is about what loyalty actually is, and when it's a virtue worth protecting, and when it becomes the thing that makes good people complicit in bad outcomes. Welcome back to American Socrates. I'm Matt Rupert. Let's start by trying to define loyalty clearly. I'm going to say that loyalty is a binding commitment to a particular person, maybe a group or a cause, that persists through difficulty and is not continuously subject to recalculation. And that last part is really essential here. A commitment where you have to seriously reevaluate it every time it becomes inconvenient is not loyalty. That's some sort of conditional arrangement. Loyalty, by definition, holds for people even when the holding is costly to the loyal one. Even when it's going to cost you personally, you're going to stick with it because you're loyal. This is what makes it so powerful and also what makes it so dangerous. The resistance to this constant recalculation is the point. That's what makes you someone that people can count on. They can rely on you because you're going to be there even when things get hard. But that same resistance means that loyalty can carry you past the point where maybe those recalculations would tell you you need to stop. Loyalty is the main ingredient of things like family, but that means that it's also the main ingredient of things like the mob. It's the main ingredient that holds armies together, but it's the same thing that keeps bandit gangs together too. It holds religions in place that help build and lift up communities, but it's also what keeps suicide cults intact. Loyalty is also inherently particular. It attaches to specific people and specific groups, and not to humanity in general. It tends to be particulars, not universals, that we're loyal to. You cannot be loyally committed to something like an abstract principle for everyone, because that wouldn't be really loyalty. That would be your basic ethics. Loyalty is what you feel towards this group of people, this family, this community, this political ideology. The particularity is not a bug, but it's the system itself, the whole mechanism of the thing. Loyalty that extends equally to everybody is just fairness, right? And fairness is a completely different virtue. From loyalty, what we want is loyalty to this group. If you're a fan of a sports team, you can't be a fan of every team. It has to be one particular team, maybe two. But the point is you can't be loyal to all of them. You have to be loyal to one rather than the others. So the particularity is why loyalty has always set in some tension with the impartial moral reasoning of ethics. Ethics, at least in its philosophical form, tends to ask questions like, what is the right thing to do regardless of the people involved? It's universal in a sense. What are you supposed to do for everybody? What is the right thing to do just as a human being? But loyalty asks, what do I owe to special people, these anointed, specific people? And both of those are legitimate questions. The problem is that they don't always have the same answer. Being loyal to the human race might mean betraying your family. and vice versa. Being loyal to your family might mean being unethical towards the human race. So let's look at the past history of all of this and see if we can glean any insights from it. For most of human history, loyalty was considered among the highest virtues, and in some traditions, the absolute highest. In Confucian ethics, for example, loyalty to one's family and to the ruler was the foundational obligation for all ethical behavior. In medieval Europe, fealty was the organizing principle of all social life, like fealty to the Lord. So much so that imagining the death of the king was itself a crime. In ancient Greek, friendship, the idea of philia, carried strong loyalty obligations. They were taken at least as seriously as the concept of justice. A man who prosecuted his own father for murder of a stranger or a servant would have been thought crazy. Dante placed betrayers in the lowest circle of hell, down below murderers and all other kinds of sinners, because betrayal was considered the deepest violation of the social bond. The center of hell was for Judas and Brutus, not for Hitler or Pol Pot. The modern suspicion of loyalty is relatively recent then, and it has specific sources. 20th century history made the costs of loyalty vivid in ways that were really hard to ignore. You had people who were loyal to the nation, people who were loyal to their party and ideology, and all of that was invoked to justify all sorts of atrocities on a scale that made virtue kind of look like a liability. The Nuremberg defense. Well, I was only following orders. I was just being loyal to my superiors, as I was expected to be. Well, that permanently damaged the moral reputation of this kind of unconditional and eternal loyalty. It was the conclusion of the world that an individual owes it to humanity to think for themselves rather than to submit totally to any group or any authority. In this sort of collision then between ethics and loyalty, ethics won. Contemporary culture adds a different layer onto the suspicion too. The valorization of individual authenticity and self-determination makes inherited or unchosen loyalties feel like constraints rather than virtues. The idea that you should be loyal to your family simply because you are family, regardless of whether they've earned it, kind of sits uneasily with a culture that emphasizes things like chosen identity, individuality, individual freedom, personal values, rather than this sort of family-first ideology that you should be submitting yourself to the collective. The result that we get is this really strange inversion. Loyalty is still seen as emotionally compelling. I think people still want it. They still feel the pull of loyalty to be loyal to each other. But it has become intellectually questionable. I think it's worth examining then whether that suspicion is a kind of wisdom or a kind of overcorrection. In the modern age, we can ask, what really is the value of loyalty? How loyal should we be to people? And at what point should we stop being loyal? There's a lot of different ways that we could try and approach this question. And I think one way that might be beneficial to us would be to try and examine the difference between loyalty to persons and loyalty to causes. These are meaningfully different, and the distinction here is going to matter for how the loyalty can go wrong. If we're talking about loyalty to persons, it tends to be relational, and in many ways, it's much more concrete. It attaches to someone generally who we know. Not always. It can attach to some kind of celebrity, famous politician, a famous football team, something like that. But more often than that, it's going to attach to somebody who's in the orbit of our lives. And so it attaches to this person that we know, whose character we can easily observe in the totality. It's harder with a celebrity. You don't see what they're doing when they're not on the camera. But with the people in your real life, you can see their actions on a regular basis. And so you have this sort of shared history with this person. Then you know who they are and you know who you're attaching yourself to. This makes it easier to be loyal in a grounded way that really rests in the actual experience and creates actual obligations then to this real person. This kind of loyalty then has its own natural limits built in, because you have to know the person well enough to know when they've genuinely crossed the line and when the relationship itself gives you the standing to say so. I know you're my friend. I know you're my husband. I know you're my father, but you've done something wrong and I can't follow you in this. I wouldn't be your friend or your spouse or your son if I didn't say so. I wouldn't be loyal to you if I didn't have the ability to tell you you've done wrong. And so loyalty in this way, at its worst, is much less damaging. There's just so much grounding in the reality of the person. You can see what's going on. The relationship is a two-way street, not a one-way street. And because of that, it's the potential for damage of the loyalty really is limited. It's very different with loyalty to causes or institutions or parties or ideologies, or even to a certain extent, that celebrities. So those tend to be more abstract and more categorical than they are personal. You're not going to be loyal here to a person, but to what that person or an institution represents. That's what you end up giving yourself and your loyalty to. And this kind of loyalty is susceptible to easy manipulation. The cause can be redefined at any time. The institution can quietly change its character without changing its name. And because your loyalty is to the abstraction rather than any concrete reality, you're very unlikely to notice these changes, this redefinition of what this thing is, what it's doing, the way it's acting. And so people who might never excuse certain bad behaviors in someone that they know personally will tend to excuse it in a leader or an institution or an ideology that they find themselves aligned with. And they do this because the loyalty is to the idea and not to the actual recorded behavior. Which I guess kind of brings me to a third category here of loyalty, a loyalty to a certain sense of identity. Whether it's a national identity, I'm an American, an ethnic identity, I'm white, or a religious identity, political identity. It's really probably the most abstract and the most volatile version of this kind of loyalty. A white supremacist ideology and ethnic identity allows a person to put all of their loyalty into this group membership in a way that allows them to be completely manipulated and completely controlled and dominated. Loyalty to identity can generate an extraordinary sense of solidarity and an extraordinary sense of mutual support as well within the group. But at the same time, it's going to come at the cost of generating the strongest pressure to suppress any kind of internal dissent, because dissent comes to feel like a betrayal of the group, rather than the legitimate criticism of specific people or specific decisions. The closer loyalty is then to actual persons you know and can hold accountable, the more it functions like a genuine virtue. The more abstract and categorical it becomes, the more it's going to function as a mechanism for suppressing your own moral judgment. In these high-controlled groups, like cults, like the NXIVM cult, the loyalty in the NXIVM cult was owed entirely to Keith Raniere as a category, as vanguard, as the embodiment of the organization's values, as the source of its members' sense of identity and purpose. When specific people raised specific concerns about specific things that he did and was doing, loyalty to the abstraction is what forced them to be silent. The category ate the person. He disappeared behind the notion of vanguard. Nobody could say what Keith did to this woman last Thursday was wrong without being told that they just didn't understand Keith, that they didn't understand the mission, that they weren't sufficiently developed in the system to really understand its true depth. Something like that. The abstraction made accountability impossible, and it kind of does so by design. That's how this kind of loyalty gets corrupted. Compare that to a skilled trades apprenticeship, where loyalty to your journeyman means, really something concrete. You want to show up on time. You aren't going to cut the corners that make your work look bad, that make his work look bad, right? You're going to have his back when someone is being unreasonable to him. That loyalty is to a specific person whose judgment you can evaluate, whose behavior you can observe, and who is accountable in a way to you in return. They owe certain obligations to you. If he starts asking you to do something dangerous or dishonest, the same loyalty that bound you to him also gives you the right to push back, because the relationship is real. It's not symbolic. You're not attached to an abstraction. You're attached to a person. So you're not loyal to the idea of the journeyman. You're loyal to old Dave, the guy, the person. And that makes all the difference in the world here. Inevitably, though, loyalty conflicts with notions like truth, justice, and conscience. This conflict, I think, is unavoidable. Loyalty will, at some point, ask you to do something that your independent moral judgment says maybe you shouldn't be doing this. And how you navigate that moment is going to define what kind of loyal person you are. The clearest example of this is that idea of family loyalty versus a sense of moral honesty. The most common version is family member who does something wrong. Maybe it's not catastrophically wrong, but it's genuinely wrong. And the question is whether you speak up, whether you're going to call them out on this. Family loyalty creates enormous pressure to silence people, to minimize certain complaints, certain criticism, to close ranks around someone. Maybe your kid is drinking and driving, and if it continues, they might kill themselves or get somebody else killed. At what point do you step in and say, hey, I love you, but what you're doing is wrong and it needs to stop? The cost of that silence is usually borne by whoever gets harmed. And the cost to the family is much more subtle. Family of dishonesty that protects the members from accountability and therefore from growth tends to corrode from the inside. Families that can't tell each other hard truths calcify around their worst dynamics. It becomes a matter of just simply managing the worst aspects of the different members and the different people. And instead of being able to enjoy their time together and grow together as a family, they end up constantly putting out fires. This distinction, I think, is important for the sense of loyalty, because loyalty to a person is not the same as loyalty to the self-image of that person. You can be deeply loyal to someone and still tell them perhaps what they need to hear, what they don't necessarily see in themselves. In fact, that may be what loyalty actually requires of you. Not protecting them from their own consequences, but just being an honest witness to who they really are. Friendship falls down a similar road. We can end up enabling our friends, covering for them, making excuses for them. Students of mine who sign in on the attendance sheet for their friends in class while their friends skip the lecture. Is that being loyal, or are you simply enabling their wrongdoing? This is the form loyalty most commonly takes when it becomes corruption. The friend who knows their friend is cheating on their partner, but they don't say anything. The colleague who knows their coworkers cutting all these corners in ways that someone's eventually going to get hurt, maybe even them, but you stay silent. The group that doesn't confront the member who's clearly out of control. In these cases, what looks like loyalty is often conflict avoidance. It's dressing up loyalty to be something that just eases your burden of being a good friend or a loyal friend. So real loyalty that takes the other person seriously as a moral agent, I think sometimes requires being the person who says the uncomfortable thing. Enabling is not loyalty. I think it's just the abdication of loyalty's actual obligations. Of course, the biggest version of this is political and ideological loyalty versus any sense of moral realism. And I think this is, again, very evident today in the United States. Political loyalty creates some of the most visible versions of this kind of conflict. People defend positions, behaviors, decisions purely from their own side that they would immediately condemn if it was happening on the other side. This is not really hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. I think it's loyalty operating at a tribal level, where consistency of principle, I think, matters less than trying to build a sense of solidarity with the end group. You want to signal to everybody that you are definitely on their team, and you are willing to ignore even absurdities, even self-harm, to show how loyal you really are. The tell here is whether someone can identify specific things their own side has gotten wrong. If you can admit, yeah, our side made a mistake, that was a mistake on our part, we shouldn't have done that. If you can say those kinds of things, you have a clean sense of loyalty. People who can't do that, who have a ready defense for, say, every decision made by their team, they're not really exercising loyalty as a virtue. They're simply using loyalty as a substitute for judgment. The difference matters because one of them is actually useful to the people they're loyal to, and the other one isn't. That ultimately degrades into a form of authoritarianism. That I'm loyal to the authority, and so whatever they say is what is right, and what is right is whatever they say. They can do no wrong. They're beyond any sort of principle, any sort of law. I've abandoned all faith in anything except doing what they want me to do. I just don't know that that's really loyalty. It's a toxic loyalty, maybe. This loyalty without limits, then, simply becomes corruption. And that's the most straightforward case that I'm trying to get at here. Unconditional loyalty, I'm going to support this person or this group no matter what they do, removes the only mechanism that a person has to keep loyalty honest. It transforms a virtue into a blank check that person can use to do horrible things. The person or institution knows it has unconditional loyalty now, and so it has no incentive to earn it. It has no incentive to do the right thing, to work hard. It can betray its members because they have given unconditional loyalty. And this is how good institutions quickly decay, and how good people end up complicit in things that they would never have chosen on the outset. It's not through a single dramatic decision, but through this small series of small accommodations, each justified by a sense of loyalty and obligation, each moving the line just a little bit further down the path. So, morality without loyalty, on the other hand, really becomes abstract. This is the less obvious case, and I think I want to spend a little time on this. A moral framework that has no room for particular obligations, that treats every person as equally deserving of your concern, regardless of your relationship to them, really describes nobody's actual moral life and produces a kind of ethical paralysis in practice. You cannot be genuinely obligated to everyone equally. The attempt to tend to produce a diffuse performative concern for these distant abstractions combined with a neglect of specific people in front of you who actually depend on you is a serious problem. I think care ethics deals with this really well. Care ethics is a feminist branch of ethical theory that focuses on like the concrete, immediate experiences of the people around us, right? We're supposed to care for those people. In that sense, everybody has people, so everybody gets cared for. This allows us to be loyal to the people we're in concrete relationships with and less concerned about those we have these more distant, more abstract relationships with. There's still a place for that. There's still a place for those abstract kinds of relationships. You know, like I'm in a relationship with the guy who made my shirt, even if he lives in China. We have an economic relationship in that way, but I don't know him. So the philosopher's version of this is the debate between partial ethics, that acts for the greatest good regardless of who's involved, and the ethics of care and particular obligations. For the purposes of this episode, we're just going to say the practical point is simple. The people in your life who have a claim on your loyalty are not obstacles to living a moral life. They're supposed to be the content of it. Your obligations to your children, your friends, your community are not distractions from these more important universal obligations. They're just simply where moral life actually takes place. Before we quit, I'd like to note that most of the loyalties that shape us most deeply are not chosen. Their family, their nationality, their religion, their community. Those are all given to us before we're even old enough to evaluate and choose them ourselves. The modern instinct is to treat unchosen loyalties as kind of less legitimate than chosen ones. You should define yourself by what you've freely embraced as an individual, like you've chosen this, and not by what you were simply born into. This instinct captures something real. Loyalty that has never been examined, that has simply been inherited and never questioned, is kind of loyalty on autopilot. It can carry you into obligations you wouldn't really endorse, not if you thought about them. And it can prevent you from building loyalties that actually fit who you are as a person. But the alternative, that treating only chosen loyalties as legitimate, misses something I think important about how character gets formed. Yes, you didn't choose your family, but the obligations and history you share with them have shaped your moral imagination in ways that purely chosen relationships almost never do. Unchosen loyalties are frequently the ones that cost the most, and therefore the ones that most develop your character. The more useful question, I think, is not whether a loyalty was chosen, but whether it has been examined and then owned. A person who has thought seriously about the obligations to their family, their community, or their country, who has asked what those loyalties require of them and where the limits of those loyalties lie, is in a very different moral position from someone who has simply never questioned them. Examined loyalty, whether it's chosen or not, is the kind that can be held with integrity. So in the end, loyalty is one of those things that just makes life feel like it means something. I think it's going to be necessary for us if we want to have a happy life. The people and communities you are genuinely committed to, not because it's always convenient, but because you've decided they matter to you. That's a large part of what gives daily life the weight and texture that makes it feel rich and enjoyable. A life without real loyalty is a life without real stakes. But loyalty that has no limits, that cannot be questioned or criticized from the inside, that's not a virtue. It's just a surrender of your judgment. And judgment, examination, is what makes loyalty meaningful. Because loyalty freely given by someone who could have chosen otherwise is worth something that unconditional loyalty is never worth. So the question I want to leave you with is, where are your real loyalties? You know, the ones you would actually pay a heavy cost for. And when was the last time that you asked whether what those loyalties are asking of you is really worth your independent judgment or your ethical principles? Thanks for tuning in to American Socrates. If today's episode of Philosophy got you thinking in new ways, make sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. New, full episodes drop every Wednesday. If you enjoyed the show, leave a review. It helps others find us, and it means a lot. And if you know someone who could use a little more practical wisdom in their life, share this episode with them. Until next time, keep questioning everything.